In the Dakota Territory, in the late summer of 1888, Einar Nilsson was digging a trench. This was not unusual work for a settler, but it was the location of the trench that caused the talk. It wasn't for irrigation. It wasn't for a root cellar. He was digging a massive 4-foot-wide moat around the perimeter of his new cabin's foundation, a foundation that did not yet exist. He worked alone, from sunrise until the light failed, his movements rhythmic and steady. The pile of dark, rich earth grew into a small mountain beside the perfectly squared hole. Travelers on the main track would slow their wagons, staring at the strange sight, a man digging a ditch around a patch of empty ground. Neighbors would ride out, ostensibly to offer help, but really to satisfy their curiosity. They would watch him for a few minutes, his shovel biting into the soil with a steady cadence, and then right away shaking their heads. In the dusty confines of the territorial trading post, the whispers began. They called it Nilsson's Folly. Some said the quiet Swede had been out in the sun too long. Others, more charitable, suggested he was simply ignorant of the ways of the prairie. He was a newcomer, after all, only 2 years in the territory. He spoke with a thick accent and kept mostly to himself, his wife Anya, and their 2 small children. He listened more than he talked, his pale blue eyes taking in everything with a calm, unnerving focus. He did not seem to be a foolish man, but this project was pure madness. It was a waste of time, a waste of effort. When winter came, that ditch would fill with snow and ice and be nothing but a hazard. What did this quiet immigrant, this man of few words and a strange engineering obsession, understand about the deep, unforgiving soul of the Dakota earth? What secret had he carried with him from the old world that every experienced farmer and builder, men who had fought this land for decades, had completely missed? The answer would not come in words. It would come with the cold. It would be delivered by a force that could crack granite and turn proud homesteads into piles of broken timber. If you believe that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the quietest corners, and that observation is a more powerful tool than assumption, then hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because the story of Einar Nilsson's Folly is a powerful reminder that the accepted way of doing things is only the accepted way until something better comes along. To understand the genius of the folly, you first have to understand the enemy. In the Dakota Territory, the enemy was not the blizzard, nor the wolf, nor the drought. Those were loud, obvious threats. The true, insidious enemy was the silence of the deep frost. It was an opponent that worked its destruction slowly, quietly, and with a power that was absolute. The settlers called it Frost Heave. It was a gentle name for a brutal force. The problem began with the soil itself. The rich, black earth that was so good for farming was a dense, clay-like loam. It held water like a sponge. In the autumn rains, the ground would become saturated. Then, as the temperatures fell, the cold would begin its slow march downward into the earth. The frost line in that part of the territory was notoriously deep, easily reaching 4 or 5 feet in a hard winter. Water freezing in the soil was not the primary issue. It was the peculiar physics of ice itself that caused the destruction. As the frost line descended, it would hit a layer of moisture-rich soil and freeze the water within it. But it didn't stop there. Through a process called cryosuction, this initial layer of ice would act like a wick, drawing more moisture up from the unfrozen ground below. This water would freeze onto the bottom of the existing ice, forming a distinct lens of pure ice that grew thicker and thicker. It was this growing lens that generated the immense, irresistible upward pressure. It was a hydraulic jack, powered by the cold itself, paragraph-paragraph. The force was geological in scale. It could lift boulders weighing tons. Against the foundation of a log cabin, it was no contest. The conventional wisdom, brought from the gentler climates of Ohio and Pennsylvania, was to build a foundation of stacked fieldstone, set as deep as a man could reasonably dig. The respected builders, men who had put up every permanent structure in the county, would tell you to go down 3 feet. That was the standard. It was the way it was always done. And every year, it failed. The failure was never catastrophic at first. It was a slow, agonizing process. In the dead of January, a family would be woken by a sound like a pistol shot, the sound of a main support beam shifting on its footing. A door that had closed perfectly in October would refuse to latch in December. By February, it would be so warped in its frame that it had to be barred shut, leaving the family to use a secondary entrance. Panes of precious glass in the windows would crack from the torque, spider webbing from the corners as the cabin frame twisted. The signs of the battle were everywhere. You could see it in the uneven floors that made a dropped coin roll to the north wall. You could see it in the zigzag cracks that appeared in the mortar of the stone chimneys. Every spring, when the thaw came, the houses would settle back down, but never in the same way. The damage was cumulative. Each winter added a new injury, a new weakness. Men spent their short summers jacking up their cabins, shimming foundations, and trying to repair the damage from the previous winter, knowing full well that the cycle would begin again in the fall. It was a losing war against the land itself. Einar Nilsson had seen this war before. He had not been a farmer in Sweden. He had been a laborer, a navvy, on the Malmbanan, the iron ore line. It was a colossal feat of engineering, a railroad built north of the Arctic Circle, through mountains and across permafrost. There he had not been an engineer, but he had watched them. He had watched the men with their strange instruments and their blueprints solve problems on a scale he could barely imagine. He saw them lay down immense beds of crushed rock, creating deep, stable foundations for the rails that would carry trains weighing hundreds of tons. He had asked a foreman why they wasted so much rock. The foreman, a tired man with a patient face, had taken a moment to explain. He told Einar that the enemy was not the cold, but the water. The rock, he explained, could not hold water. It was full of air gaps. Any moisture that seeped in would drain right through, leaving nothing for the frost to grab onto. They were not trying to stop the cold. They were taking away its weapon. When Einar arrived in Dakota and saw the settlers fighting the frost heave, he saw them all making the same mistake. They were building walls against the pressure. They were setting their foundations in the dense, wet clay, the very material that fueled the ice lenses. They were fighting the force head-on. Einar knew from his time on the railroad that you could not win a fight against such a power. You had to get out of its way. You had to change the conditions of the battle. You had to guide the water. And that is why, in the late summer of 1888, he began to dig his folly. The first stage of his work was pure, relentless labor. He dug the trench 5 feet deep, a full foot below the deepest known frost line in the region. He made it 4 feet wide. He did not use a plumb line. He used a water level of his own making, a long, hollow reed with glass vials at each end, to ensure the bottom of the trench had a very slight, almost imperceptible slope. It drained away from the cabin site toward a low-lying patch of ground 50 yards away. This detail went unnoticed by the onlookers. To them, it was just a ditch. To Einar, it was the most important part of the entire system. It was the escape route. Then came the hauling. The nearest creek with the right kind of stone and sand was 3 miles away. For 6 weeks he made the trip twice a day with his wagon and his 2 sturdy oxen. He shoveled gravel and coarse sand until his hands were raw, hauled it back to his plot, and carefully began to fill the trench. He didn't just dump it in. He laid it down in layers, a foot of coarse gravel, then 6 inches of sand, then more gravel, tamping each layer down. He was creating a massive subterranean sponge of material that was non-frost susceptible. The countless gaps between the stones and grains of sand meant that water could never saturate it in a way that would allow a solid ice lens to form. It was a drainage field, a perimeter drain on a homesteader's scale. It was during this phase that Silas Croft paid him a visit. Silas was the most respected builder in 3 counties. He was a stonemason by trade, a man whose work was known for its durability and precision. He had built the stone church in the main settlement, a structure that had withstood 20 Dakota winters without a single significant crack. His opinion carried the weight of proven success. He approached Einar not with mockery, but with the genuine concern of an expert seeing a novice make a terrible mistake. He watched Einar for a long time, his arms crossed, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and certain. "Einar," he said, skipping the pleasantries, "you need to stop this. You're creating a trap for yourself." Einar paused, leaning on his shovel, and looked at the older man. He nodded a greeting, but said nothing. Silas gestured at the half-filled trench. "I see what you're thinking. You're trying to keep the frost away from your footings, but this is the wrong way to do it. All this loose rock and sand. When the autumn rains come and the snow melts in the spring, water is going to pour into this trench like it's a funnel. It'll have nowhere to go. The ground on all sides will freeze solid, and you'll have a perfect ring of ice locked around your house. When that freezes solid, the expansion will be inward and upward. It won't just heave your foundation, it'll rip the sills right off your cornerstones. I've seen it happen with poorly dug cellars. This is 100 times worse." It was a sound, logical argument based on years of hard-won experience. It was the exact conclusion any reasonable person would draw. The audience for this exchange, a pair of neighbors who had stopped their wagon, nodded in agreement. Silas had put their own vague unease into precise, damning words. Einar Nilsson wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. He looked at Silas, then at the trench, then back at Silas. His reply was simple, delivered in his slow, careful English. "The water needs a place to go, Silas," he said. "It does not like to be trapped." He then turned and went back to his work, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel the only further comment he offered. Silas stood there for another minute, frustrated and dismayed. He had tried to warn the man. He had done his duty. He turned and walked away, shaking his head. The story of his warning and of Einar's stubborn, nonsensical reply spread through the community. The name Nilsson's Folly was now cemented. It was no longer just a curiosity. It was a confirmed case of foolishness, certified by the region's foremost expert. The mockery at the trading post grew louder. Men would joke about taking up a collection to buy the Swede a boat for his basement come springtime. Einar ignored it all. Once the trench was filled, he began the foundation itself. Inside the protective perimeter of sand and gravel, he laid his massive, hand-hewn cornerstones. They were set only 2.5 feet deep, a shockingly shallow depth that drew even more scorn. But they were not sitting on the volatile clay loam. They were sitting on a 5-foot deep, 4-foot wide, perfectly drained bed of stable material. After the foundation was laid and the cabin built, a sturdy, simple structure of tightly fitted logs. The system was complete, and now its true function could be understood. It was not a wall. It was not a fortress. It was a lung. It was a carefully constructed zone of pressure release. When the autumn rains came, the water saturated the surrounding earth as it always did. But as it seeped sideways toward the cabin, it encountered the gravel field. Instead of stopping and pooling, it percolated down through the loose material, following the path of least resistance. It flowed along the gently sloped bottom of the trench and drained away harmlessly into the low-lying ground. Einar had not built a shield to block the frost's power. He had built a channel to divert its fuel. By keeping the soil immediately around and under his shallow foundation relatively dry, he ensured that no significant ice lenses could ever form there. The ground would still freeze, but it would be a dry freeze, without the immense hydraulic power that was tearing his neighbors' homes apart. He had learned the lesson of the railroad. You do not fight the force of nature. You understand the system and make it work for you. He had built a solution so counterintuitive that no one else could see it. They were all looking at the trench, but the real work was being done by gravity and particle size, forces they couldn't see. That year, winter did not creep in. It fell upon the territory like a judgment. November was colder than anyone could remember, with a mean-spirited wind that seemed to come straight from the Arctic. The ground froze hard and fast. December brought a blizzard that buried the landscape under 3 feet of snow, isolating homesteads and making travel a life-threatening gamble. And then came January. The sky cleared to a brilliant, merciless blue, and the temperature plummeted. It was called the Great Freeze of '88. For 2 weeks, the thermometer at the trading post never rose above 0. For 7 consecutive days, it registered between 20 and 40 degrees below. It was a cold that was a physical presence, a cold that cracked trees open with a sound like a rifle shot, a cold that made metal so brittle an axe head could shatter on a piece of frozen oak. It was the kind of generational event that would serve as the ultimate, impartial test of every theory of survival the settlers held. The conventional methods did not just fail, they disintegrated. The reports began to trickle in from those brave or desperate enough to travel. The Miller family's cabin, built just 2 years prior, had its main beam crack in the middle of the night. They were living in their barn, huddled with the livestock for warmth. The Jameson place had its foundation heave so violently on the north side that the entire structure tilted, and the stovepipe separated from the roof thimble, filling the single room with blinding, choking smoke. They barely escaped with their lives. Everywhere, the story was the same. The sounds of destruction became a nightly terror, a sudden, violent groan from the walls, a sharp crack from the floorboards, the sickening grind of wood and stone in a battle against a silent, invisible titan. Families were burning through their precious firewood at an alarming rate, yet the cold inside their homes was relentless. A rime of frost coated the walls. Water froze in the bucket just a few feet from the stove. Breath crystallized in the air. This wasn't just hardship, it was a siege. Silas Croft was not immune. His own house, which he had built with his own hands 20 years before, was suffering. It was better built than most, with a deep, carefully laid stone foundation that had served him well for 2 decades. But this winter was different. The frost had found a way past his defenses. He heard the groans and creaks like every other man, but for him, the sounds were a personal affront, a challenge to his entire life's work. A hairline crack appeared in the plaster above the main hearth, his masterpiece of stonework. Each morning, it was slightly wider. He measured it with a grim satisfaction. It was a 1/4 inch wide now. His doors were sticking. The beautiful double-hung windows he had freighted in from St. Paul now refused to open or close properly. His expertise, his reputation, was being cracked and warped along with his house. He felt a deep, chilling fear, not just for his safety, but for his certainty. Everything he knew to be true about building in this land was being proven false by the brutal, undeniable reality of the cold. And in the midst of his own struggle, his thoughts kept turning to the quiet Swede, Einar Nilsson. He thought of that ridiculous trench, that Folly. He imagined the ring of solid ice that must be gripping that cabin now, a frozen python squeezing the life out of it. He felt a pang of guilt. He had warned the man, but perhaps he should have been more forceful, more insistent. The Swede was stubborn, but he had a wife and 2 small children. No one deserved to face this cold in a broken home. The thought of that family, trapped in a cabin being torn apart by a flaw of his own design, gnawed at him. Professional pride gave way to human concern. He had to go and see. He had to know if they were safe. Pulling on his heaviest buffalo coat and wrapping his face in wool until only his eyes were visible, Silas set out. The journey of 2 miles was a brutal ordeal. The air was so cold it felt like a solid thing, searing his lungs with every breath. The snow crunched under his boots with a high-pitched alien shriek. The wind cut across the open prairie, driving particles of ice that stung his exposed skin. His beard, damp from his own breath, froze into a solid mass of ice within minutes. He was a man moving through a world that wanted him dead. He topped the small rise that overlooked the Nilsson homestead. The cabin stood silent and dark against the snow, a plume of smoke rising ruler straight from the chimney into the still, frigid air. There were no signs of distress, no broken windows, no tilted roofline, but the silence worried him. In this cold, silence could mean anything. It could mean peace, or it could mean death. As he got closer, his anxiety grew. He expected to see frantic activity, signs of a struggle against the cold, but there was nothing. Just the quiet cabin and the smoke. He reached the door, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of dread and a grim sense of, "I told you so." He raised a heavily mitted hand and knocked. The sound was unnaturally loud in the frozen silence. He waited. For a long moment, there was no response. He was about to knock again, harder this time, when he heard the sound of the bar being lifted from inside. The door swung inward. The first thing that hit him was the warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove, but a wave of calm, steady, and humid warmth. It rolled over him like a physical thing, melting the frost on his eyebrows and thawing the frozen mask of his beard. He stood there, dumbfounded, on the threshold between 2 different worlds. The world outside was 40 degrees below zero. The world inside was summer. Einar Nilsson stood before him, holding the door. He was in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, Silas saw a scene of impossible domestic tranquility. The 2 children, Lars and Sophia, were on the floor, playing with a set of carved wooden animals. They were barefoot. On the far side of the single large room, Anja Nilsson was at a large table, kneading a great mound of dough for bread, her own sleeves rolled up past her elbows. A pot of something simmered on the stove, releasing a gentle steam into the air. There was no frantic energy, no huddling around the fire. There was no rime of frost on the interior walls. The glass in the windows was clear and dry. It was a portrait of ordinary life, made extraordinary by the lethal conditions just a few inches of wood away. Silas stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and stood there, stamping the snow from his boots, unable to process the sensory shock. The air was warm, but it was also fresh. It didn't have the stale, smoky quality of a cabin sealed tight against the cold. Einar simply nodded at him. "Silas, it is a cold day." Silas could only stare. He was a practical man, a man who believed in evidence. And the evidence before him was a profound and total contradiction of everything he knew. He began to investigate, his builder's mind taking over from his shocked senses. He walked to the north wall, the one that took the brunt of the wind, the one that in his own house was cold enough to form ice. He pressed his bare hand against the logs. It was cool, yes, but it was not the life-leeching cold of a failing structure. It was the neutral cool of solid, stable wood, and it was bone-dry. He looked at the door he had just come through. He examined the frame. It was perfectly square, the gaps even all around. "Open it," he said, his voice raspy. Einar opened the door. It swung without a sound. Without a hint of scraping or binding, he closed it. It latched with a soft, satisfying click. Silas moved to the nearest window and performed the same test, lifting and lowering the sash. It moved smoothly in its tracks. These were not the actions of a house under stress. These were the signs of a house at peace with its foundation. His mind reeled, searching for an explanation. Perhaps Einar was simply burning an astonishing amount of wood. He looked at the wood box next to the stove. It was full, but not overflowing. "How much wood are you burning?" Silas asked, the question sounding accusatory. Einar shrugged. "Not so much. Less than last winter, I think. The logs are seasoned well." The answer was so calm, so matter-of-fact, that it was more stunning than any boast. Less wood? In this cold? It was impossible. Finally, Silas turned to the ultimate question, the one that lay at the heart of the matter. "The foundation," he said. "Your cornerstones. Have you looked at them?" "Yes," Einar said. "They are quiet." "Show me." Einar lifted a trapdoor in the floor, revealing a small, dark opening to the shallow crawl space below. He lit a lantern and handed it to Silas. "You look. I will watch the children." Silas took the lantern and descended the short ladder. The air below the floor was cool and smelled of earth, but it was not the deathly cold he expected. He held the lantern high, the flickering light playing over the massive stones of his trade. He moved from corner to corner, examining each of the main foundation stones. They were perfect. They sat level and true on the gravel bed. The mortar Einar had used to seal the gaps between the first course of logs, and the stone was pristine, without a single crack. He ran his hand over the dirt floor. It was cold and dry. There was no sign of frost, no hint of the telltale dampness that preceded the heave. The house was utterly, completely stable. He climbed back up the ladder and handed the lantern to Einar. He stood in the middle of that impossibly warm room, the sounds of the children playing softly in the background. He looked at the barefoot boy. He looked at the woman kneading her bread. He looked at the quiet Swede who had endured the community's mockery in silence. And in that moment, Silas Croft's world, a world built on 20 years of hard-won certainty, cracked its foundation. He took a deep breath, the warm, clean air filling his lungs. His voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with an emotion he couldn't name, a mix of awe, shame, and profound, liberating humility. "I was wrong, Einar," he said, the words coming out slowly, each one carrying the weight of his entire reputation. "I was completely and utterly wrong. My own hearth has a crack in it. The church foundation. It is failing. Men are losing their homes. But you?" He gestured around the room, at the peaceful, impossible scene. "Your house is silent." He met Einar's calm gaze. The Swede showed no triumph, no hint of, "I told you so." He simply waited. "You must show me," Silas said, his voice now urgent. "When this freeze breaks, you must show all of us. Because what you have done here, it changes everything." When the great freeze of '88 finally broke, the stories of its toll were grim. 2 families had lost their homes entirely. Dozens more cabins were severely damaged, requiring months of backbreaking repair work. Livestock had been lost. The winter had exacted its price. But amidst the tales of hardship, a new story began to spread. It was the story of the quiet Swede and his warm, silent cabin. It was told first by Silas Croft, and because it came from him, people listened. They listened with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. That spring, as soon as the ground was workable, A small procession of men arrived at Einar Nilsson's homestead. At the head was Silas Croft, no longer an expert coming to dispense wisdom, but a student coming to learn. He brought with him the other builders and the most respected farmers of the region. They gathered around the perimeter of the house, looking at the ground, trying to understand the magic that lay beneath it. With no ceremony and no arrogance, Einar explained his system. He didn't use technical terms like cryosuction or non-frost susceptible backfill. He spoke in simple, practical language. He explained the slope of the trench. He explained why the gravel and sand were important. He ended with the same simple phrase he had used with Silas months before. "You do not fight the ice," he said to the assembled men. "You guide the water away. Then the ice has no power." They dug a small test pit, and he showed them the layers of rock and sand, and how dry the soil was near the foundation stones. They saw, and they understood. The adoption was not immediate, but it was steady. The name Nilsson's Folly was never spoken again. In its place, people started calling it the Nilsson Foundation, or more simply, the Dakota Drain. That summer, Silas Croft retrofitted his own house, a monumental task that involved digging a massive trench around his existing foundation and backfilling it by hand. The following winter, for the first time in 20 years, his house was silent. His conversion was complete, and he became the system's most fervent evangelist. In the years that followed, the landscape of the territory began to change. New cabins were built with wide, shallow foundations sitting on deep beds of gravel. The sight of a man digging a wide trench around his home site was no longer a cause for mockery, but a sign of wisdom. The seasonal battle against the frost heave didn't end, but it became a winnable war. The sound of cracking timbers in the deep of winter faded from a terrifying certainty into a memory of the old ways. The real impact wasn't measured in level floors or plumb door frames. It was measured in human lives. It was measured in the infant who survived its first winter because the cabin was no longer riddled with icy drafts. It was measured in the family that could use every room in their house in February, not just the small space around the stove. It was measured in the newfound sense of security, the feeling that a home was a fortress that could truly withstand the worst the land could throw at it. Einar Nilsson never sought fame or fortune for his idea. He shared his knowledge freely, then returned to the quiet rhythm of his own life. He had done what he set out to do. He had kept his family safe. The story of Einar Nilsson's Folly is a powerful parable. It speaks to the conflict between entrenched tradition and quiet innovation. It highlights the danger of dismissing an idea simply because it is unfamiliar, and the wisdom of listening to those who bring a different perspective, forged in a different fire. It is a testament to the power of empirical evidence over popular opinion, and a reminder that the most elegant solutions often come not from fighting a problem with brute force, but from deeply understanding its nature. That simple, intuitive principle Einar learned from the railroad engineers in the Arctic is still at the heart of modern engineering today. Civil engineers in cold climates now use what are called frost-protected shallow foundations, using advanced insulation and drainage materials to achieve the exact same effect. They are not fighting the frost, they are managing the water. If this story changed the way you think about solving a problem, hit that like button to let us know. And subscribe for more stories of forgotten wisdom from the frontiers of human ingenuity. We're left with one final question for you. What's the coldest winter you have ever faced, and what did it teach you? Let us know in the comments below. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account, created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and physical principles of frost heave and frost-protected foundations are real and accurately described, the characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of imagination. This narrative is intended to illustrate historical concepts and should not be taken as a guide for actual construction or engineering practices.